All right, welcome everyone to the latest installment of our Wednesday walk through Culver history. Every week here at Culver Academies History Facebook page at 4 p.m. I'm Jeff Kenney, Culver Academies Museum and Archives Manager, and I'm here with Kurt Garner. Kurt is an architectural historian from Plymouth here in Marshall County, just up the road from Culver, and he's placed how many properties have you now kind of been in charge of putting on the National Register of Historic Places here in Indiana?
So there's been 173 nominations, so I'm pretty proud of that number, but it's a formidable task. It's like a research paper for every single nomination.
Absolutely. Well, and yet you've made time to be here, which is great. So I wanted Kurt to come here. I know he looked at these cabins behind us back a few years ago for some research here for Culver Summer Schools and Camps. Of course, we're at the Woodcraft Camp, and behind us are the two, and we say cabins, of course the entire camp is cabins, right? But these are two iconic cabins that if you're a former woodcrafter or staff or faculty or whatever, you would recognize these buildings immediately. And the one that is closest to us, and we'll get some closer looks at it, is ostensibly the earliest of the two cabins. The word is that this cabin goes back to the 1830s pioneer era there on Lake Maxinkuckee. Was brought over to the Culver property in 1913, just a year after the Woodcraft Camp was launched. And and it's been at all three. There were three Woodcraft Camp sites, this obviously being the most recent one, starting in 1963. So in 1963, this closest cabin was brought over from the former campsite there, kind of to the north of today's Memorial Chapel, and has been here ever since. As you see on the front of it, it's the Indian Lore cabin. It's kind of a storage building and headquarters for the Indian Lore Department and its material. And the further cabin is a little bit more recent. Again, neither of these do we have deep knowledge that we can substantiate on their origins, but we do know that the further cabin away was a gift of D.B. Frampton. D.B. or Pete Frampton graduated from the D&B, Drum Bugle Corps, in the Woodcraft Camp in 1937, and later from Culver Military Academy in 1941. He actually stayed on as a post-grad until 1943, and then served in World War II and was captured in 1944 in the Battle of the Bulge. So he's going to come back and become president of the Summer Schools Alumni Association from 1968 to 70. He donated this cabin, which is not a local cabin. He donated this cabin in 1963 when the new camp opened. So Kurt and I are just going to take a little look at the cabins. He's going to bring his architectural expertise, which is beyond my abilities, to kind of talk a little bit about what you see when you see these early cabins.
Log cabin construction really was never really changed much from the very early 1700s into when we quit building log cabins in the middle 1800s. So what you're looking at is pretty representative of what log construction would have been during that 1830s 1860s kind of period. Now log cabin construction kind of picked up again in the early 1900s, but it wouldn't have looked anything like this. That was all stock lumber that was fitted and sawn. And I know that there's some kind of question, well, what is original to these? And if you imagine having a cabin that's 100, 200 years old, well, you're going to have to replace pieces as you go along. And you can kind of see that. There's things that have been done to keep the cabins preserved at this site. But, it's just neat. I mean, who doesn't love a log cabin? So it's just neat that Culver managed to preserve these and bring them here for kids to enjoy.
Well, give me a sec. I just might add, one of the interesting features of this cabin, the former Woodcraft Museum, is we referenced this in another video segment we did on the Culver Founders Home and Homestead, which originally had these whale jawbones from Nantucket that were kind of the ceremonial entryway from the Lake Pier for Henry Harrison Culver, the school's founder's home. Those were brought over here at some point and placed in front of this cabin. You saw pictures, which we'll show here in that earlier video, and some of you may remember, as I think it was a tradition, to take a little piece of those whale jawbones home. So of course they deteriorated and went to the wayside. But that was another interesting feature here. I might also add that it was in the 1967 period that the what would become the Woodcraft Museum, it is not a museum today, is constructed here in the 1963 camp, which ends the life of this building as a camp museum.
So with the Frampton cabin, you see a lot of weathering in these logs, and that's what I would expect to see in something that is, closing in on 200 years old. And it also has this more notched kind of construction on the corners, whereas the other cabin, it's more of a dovetail notch. So there's some interesting differences between the cabins. Well, with the Frampton cabin, the other thing that's interesting, it's true both, is that they seem like they're the right proportions, at least on the lower level. They may have been changed a little bit. The roof line might have been changed when they brought them in and repurposed them here. And this is a fantastic kind of demonstration of what an aged log would look like in a cabin. And then as you go up, there's that log that cuts across that has some obvious notching out of it,
right,
that should have either floor joists or something that it's carrying for a loft area, and that's gone. So we know that at least on this camp or on this cabin that there's been some changes in terms of the height.
I might add, just from as a historical note, the Potawatomi are really forced away in 1838. The first pioneers come here in 1836. European pioneers come here in 1836. So from that time, from 1836, or you could say 1838, until the railroad comes in the 1880s, and you would know much more about the evolution of architecture during that period. But there's still cabins for several years after the arrival of the
Sure. One of the latest cabins that we know of is up in West Township, and it was on the Menominee Reserve, so it was built later, and that was built in about 1846, and it was about this size, but it had that upper floor to it. I just think it's neat because it resonates with so many of the kids that attended camp here. I think it's just neat that Culver committed to restoring them, because I think a few years ago there was some question about do we do that, and they've made improvements, and what a great legacy then to pass on to future generations of campers.
Absolutely, yeah. I do know these are kind of, again, iconic here on the camp for the campers that come and faculty, staff. Again, thanks to Kurt Garner, architectural historian. You have a blog if people want to read more of your thoughts.
Well, I have my Hoosier Happenings blog, and I cover all sorts of things, histories around Indiana and various things, and my website too is a lot of architectural kind of historical architectural elements to it. It's just
kwgarner.com. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again to Kurt Garner for joining us. As always, I'm Jeff Kenney, Culver Academies Museum and Archives Manager, here every Wednesday at 4 p.m. for Wednesday Walks Through Culver History. We'll see you next week.